Welcome back to Nerdbeardia. For you today I have the second chapter of the Veil Riders. A Veil Rider loomed over his battle brother, looking over his shoulder at the ripped up human carcass in front of both of them. What do you think? I am not quite sure. The Veil Rider opened his large hand and lightly traced them above the huge claw marks that were left in the meat and bone of the corpse, being so strong and sharp that they cleaved right through the ribs of the rescue team member and dug into the flesh below. A bear? But bears aren't even close to being this big, not even polar bears. Spoopy, murmured the Veil Rider that was leaning over his shoulder, and he began to walk back to the main encampment, leaving the small group huddled around the ripped up bodies. He found Yule yawning and mixing up a pouch of dehydrated coffee. A small group of Veil Riders huddled around the small jet stove and waiting for their own water to heat. "Sir," the Veil Rider said, placing his fist against his chest in a mocking Jaeger salute. Yule continued his yawn, groaning out softly before looking at the Veil Rider with his eyes half-lidded and tired. "You'll find no sir here, just a Yule." The Veil Rider grinned, and instead did a normal military salute. "Right, Yule, sir." All the Veil Riders gathered around the quietly roaring jet stove chuckled appreciatively of the well-timed humor, while Yule shook his head and dumped a packet of sugar into his coffee, the small piece of the packet's paper top still in his teeth. "Report." "Well, as far as Cole can tell, it was some kind of bear, but bigger than a polar bear. Sounds like a problem for Betty to fix," Yule said, spitting the piece of paper off his lip while the rest of the Veil Riders murmured their agreement, taking the rumbling pot off the jet burner and pouring the hot water into their own retort pouches. Yule sent the Veil Rider off to grab coal, then turned slightly and took stock of the little fortification setup. They quickly realized that they had a pretty good firing position, with a little bit of elevation on the hill and the sprawling grasslands before them. Without any real construction tools, and with the trees up on top of the rocky little boulder hills behind them being too thin, they decided to go full bulge on this one and dig foxholes and trench lines, as well as digging emplacements up on the hill itself. These hill emplacements were where Betty and the rest of the crew sat, the Veil Riders behind them staring down at the locations below like curious birds of prey. There was also a new addition added to the weapons teams. Coco sending the smallest of the Veil Riders back through the Veil to not only test the obsidian marker stones, but to also send requests for more supplies. The Veil Rider came back, squalling about the deep bitter cold of the Veil, and some days after him came around 6 to 7 crates. In these crates were more food, water, stoves, fuel, ammunition for Betty and the other crew serfs, and a very special treat for anything that gets within 3,000 yards of the camp. Coco's request for an 81mm mortar had apparently been approved. The tube itself had seen better days, and the ground plate looked like it had been run over, but the Veil Riders are more than happy to take these army sloppy seconds and put it into an advantage position and dug a nice little hole for it to sit in. With the mortar came a few boxes of high explosive and illumination rounds, just in case. All around the cave entrance they had trenches and foxholes set in place, using rotations of Veil Riders who occupied them and kept watch over the entryway to their encampment. Yule also noted, as he touched the reconstituted coffee to his lips, that the Veil Riders were already making this place into a home. Someone had made a sign reading, "Welcome to Fort Kickass, no elves allowed," near the front of the little camp, and others had set up lean-tos or hooches where they slept or relaxed. He also noticed with much annoyance that someone had actually dragged a fucking body pillow here. Good thing Megumin could pull sentry duty, he supposed. Come on, mate, what kind of place would this be without a waifu in the mix? Yule turned his head to look over his shoulder at the Australian sitting sprawled out in the grass behind him, apparently seeing Yule stare daggers at the body pillow, which wore a helmet and an M4 strapped to it. "Shut up, Cockrum." Jovial Australian-flavored laughter bounced off Yule's back as he began to walk away to inspect the fortification lines. It was honestly a miracle that kangaroo kicker even made it into the outfit, having sold everything and burned every favor he had to get a ticket to the States, and fake a vacation visa, or whatever it was they do. As Yule was helping stack sacks of earth to create a small pillbox, his coffee pouch steaming happily nearby, Cole finally arrived and made his report. Yule stood up, dusting the dirt off his pants and hands, and walked up the rough earthen entryway into the pillbox, picking up his retort pouch on the way out. "Ah, Mr. Cole," Yule drawled out in a friendly manner. "I hear you think a giant bear got a snack in before we arrived." "Not before we arrived, but certainly some time before. The bodies were heavily decomposed, but not as much as they should have been." "Are you implying that we're dealing with a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff?" Cole shrugged. "To some degree." "Thank you, Mr. Cole. That's all I needed." Cole gave you a lazy salute, but Yule didn't return it. This was a militia after all, and Yule didn't even hold a rank besides co-commander with Coco, and that was only because he was one of the few older guys in the Veil Riders. He'd be damned if others were going to call him sir. That night, all those who were not on watch or sleeping gathered up near the middle of the camp, many of them taking that moment to rip open MREs and have their dinner. In front of them was one of the tech geeks, or as most of them in the camp called her, the Gremlin. Gremlin was a very slight woman, mostly muscle and sinew at 5'1", but she knew her tech and also owned a shitload of personal drones that she brought with her. During the day, she had thrown up a pair of the monsters, which had been circling an ever-growing radius around the camp and feeding information to her little setup of tough books and gaming laptops. Piece by piece, she was building a map of the area with actual pictures taken from the drones, and it was all coming together in the murky gloom of the night. Due to the many reasons of don't want to be seen, Fort Kickass, no elves allowed, or Fort Kickass, or fucking E for short thanks to Cockrum, no campfires would be lit during the day or night, the camp relying instead on chemical heaters and jet stoves to heat up things or cook. Due to this, the lights in the 6 laptops in front of the small group threw eerie shades of green and blue onto the small group behind Gremlin, of which Yule and Coco were a part of. This time, both Yule and Coco had retorts of coffee, and somehow Coco had found a silly straw, which he used to slurp his field mocha with. "Lots of trees so far. Plenty of open plains, more hills behind us," Yule muttered to Coco, his thick mustache almost perched on top of his retort pouch. Coco's silly straw gurgled as he stopped drinking, gesturing with the pouch at the map slowly filling up the screens. "And there's the village right there to consider. Look to be rustic. I don't see any metal roofs or anything, and those are clearly some kind of animals pulling carts." Yule nodded slightly, now chewing worriedly on the lip of his pouch, thinking Iron Age? Middle Age. "Those buildings look like something you would have found in a French village during Charlemagne." Coco checked his teeth a few times. "Definitely Middle Ages, which means we can keep fire superiority." "Yeah, until one of those sons of bitches throws a fireball at us or some shit," Yule growled. Gremlin, Coco, and everyone else around the laptops laughed quietly, and after a few more minutes, Gremlin had the maps printed out and in the co-commander's hands. It was thanks to Gremlin they could even get some kind of electrical power going, as she knew how to work the little wind generator that happily spun and sung about 20 feet above them on a pole. Yule was curious as to how the fuck the Kekistani and Gadsden flags also got up there under the generator, but no one wanted to own up to it, and he just didn't have the fucks to spare when it came to taking it down. Besides, if anything living saw the flags and tried to make contact, they would be facing the bristling guns of Fort Kickass. After conversing with Coco a bit more about the village, they both agreed that they should at least put it under some kind of observation, just to see what was going on there, and what kind of people inhabit the place. It's within enough of a distance that some form of overlap is inevitable, and if they ever let loose the entire firing line worth of rifles into a target, there is no way the village will not hear the crack and pop of ordnance turning some goblin into jelly. When the maps were all in hand, and all the fun over, the small gaggle of Veil Riders dispersed, with Yule slowly walking in the dark towards his own hooch he had dug into the ground. Yule groaned as he kicked back onto his sleeping system, bundling his wool camping blanket behind his shoulders and head to prop him up. He had a small light attached to the roof of his little camping hooch and clicked it to the red setting, casting Yule in a grim, dull crimson light as he looked at the maps. "Mystery village to the west," he sighed, draining the last of his coffee pouch. "Empty, mysterious forest to the north and east, and us." He tapped a finger where the camp lay to the south, on its little range of hills. The night crept on as sentries changed rotations. Men and women chatted as they gathered together around the softly glowing lights of stoves, and Veil Riders peered out into the dim of the distance. Alrighty, so your job is to take a looky-loo at the town or whatever it is. Let us know what's going on, and then boogie on home. Any questions? Yule stood before the gaggle of 8 men and women before him, one hand in his pocket as another held a protein bar, his fingers fiddling with the wrapper. He didn't mind the first strike bars that cropped up in the MREs, but they really did a number on his teeth just trying to chew through them. The group was hand-picked from the Veil Riders who had the best cardio and optics, 3 of which were men and 5 were women. The women were avid runners and joggers, and had the legs to prove it. 2 of the men were fun runners, and their rifles sported long-distance optics that could peer down into the town from an advantage position. One of the men was Domino. He was not a fun runner, but was just super eager to get a scope on something breathing in this realm. Yule could understand. They had expected to be besieged by goblins and slathering beasts as soon as they came out of the Vale. But so far it's been mostly a group camping trip while trying to lure in strange birds with pieces of MRE crackers. A bubbly redhead held up her rifle and her camera phone at the same time. Are we allowed to take pictures? Yes. Are we allowed to kill them if they become hostile? Asked one of the men, who idly rubbed a finger along the rear eyepiece rim of his scope. I'd prefer if you didn't. Just try to wing them or something and make a quick getaway. Remember, the key here is to not get seen and to just report. Yule eyed them slightly peeved. He'd failed to realize just how bad his back was getting, and sleeping on the ground was no longer suited to him. It was starting to make him crankier in the mornings and warping away his patience to boot. After ironing out some other small details of the mission, he sent them off, and they went happily jogging away from Fort Kickass. There was some mild jeering as well from those on sentry duty, half of whom had their comic books or mangas out to take advantage of the morning sunlight to read. As the sounds of boots hitting the ground faded away, Yule heard the chunks of actions being worked from up on top of the hill, and saw the crew servers were taking the time to do daily maintenance. He had to yell at them yesterday because they were doing it all at once, but today they were thankfully doing it one at a time, so that way only one weapon was down compared to all of them at once. He blinked blearily into the sky and sniffed, bringing the protein bar to his mouth as he thought to himself. It was probably a good idea that he sent the group off with 2 sets of maps. The last thing he needed was a bunch of trigger-happy commandos walking around Fantasyland looking for a reason to split some poor creature's face or something. Well, good morning, sunshine, Coco crooned with a smile, and Yule rolled his eyes. Did you send out that team already? The team jogged happily across the plush grasslands of the fields, and didn't even break much of a sweat thanks to the cool morning air and how fresh the air was. The travel was silent, with nothing more than the jangle of canteens or rattle of magazines to break the silence. Using the maps, they were able to recognize some terrain features and use them on the move, not needing to stop and take out the compass, and had an easy time dead reckoning their way to the village. When they finally arrived about 300 yards away, they broke line of sight and crawled through the brush the rest of the way, finding a nice clear spot to peek out of. Farmers, eh? Whispered Domino as he looked down the scope of his rifle, training the MilDOT sight along behind a man who was carrying a bundle of wood. Very curious. Look at their ears, murmured another Veil Rider, a raven-haired female who everyone called Kentucky, due to her father owning a KFC restaurant. They're really low. Elves, maybe. Gabriel, who was from Georgia, flicked back and forth between his optic settings. Definitely elves, but I expected fancier elves. You know, Lord of the Rings and all that. The group quietly chatted to each other, while the bubbly blonde, who went by Chicks, busily snapped pictures on her phone, holding the camera near the eyepiece of her scope. They sat and watched the elves for hours, watching them go about their day and do their village routines. The place was definitely more elvish up close, with many of the houses sporting long, spiraling carvings. The windows seemed to be more for show than actual use, and even the animals they used seemed more alive than what anything on Earth would be. What was truly strange was how normal they looked. There wasn't much spell casting or great feats of magic, but regular people going about their lives. Children giggled and played in the streets or yards of the homes, dogs barked and chased after them, and the parents watched from time to time while working. Every home had its own little plot of land. Each had their own little gardens, and every elf seemed to have made it their own in some way. A house would be sporting a fish theme, another a bird theme, and so on. They reckoned the village must have around 200 or so elves in it, and must have been exporting some kind of grain. The group spotted a decently wooded area nearer to the village and low-crawled to it, keeping their heads low just to make sure they weren't spotted. Chicks was chewing bubblegum the entire time, which caused a few pucker factor moments when she forgot she couldn't blow bubbles. But the team made it to the wooded area. Chicks went back to taking pictures while everyone else scoped in on the bigger buildings near the center of the village, the largest of which had to be assumed as the inn. "Betcha Yule would sell one of our souls for a bed in that," Kentucky said with a chuckle, and focused her own reticule on a pair of elves sitting outside of the inn on a bench. Domino giggled to himself. He would certainly growl less. Man-bear-pig at its finest. From this close they got an actual good look at the elves. They were pretty, for certain, but many of them had rugged features that compared nicely to their line of work. Their ears were lower on their heads and went more sideways than up. Their hair seemed to always be braided, and the men actually sported small rugged beards. They looked like Finns, but friendlier. The team all guffawed at each other silently, but kept taking down notes. Besides whatever it was they farmed here, they also seemed to be breeding horses. They hadn't seen them, but on the other side of the village there were what looked like racks and racks of stables, and further out could be seen big herds of horses. They were sleek-looking creatures that looked well tended after. Hell, even the damn chickens looked elfish, their feathers way too sleek and clean when compared to anything they had back at home. Kentucky silently whistled to herself. Wonder how they taste in secret herbs and spices. Again, quiet laughter was shared amongst the team, but was cut short when a distant thum was heard. "Y'all hear that?" Gabriel snapped, and twisted his head to look behind him. Thum, thum, snap, 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 thum, thum, thum. Gunfire. Echoes of gunfire reverberated in the distance. Movement. Lots of movement, Chick said in a slightly higher tone than what she usually used, and was looking down the scope of her rifle. She saw the people in the village pricking up to the noise, and they seemed to be worried. Some of them running to their homes and fetching what looked like spears. "Time to go!" Domino cheered, and picked up his M24. Surprise now gone, they stood up and immediately began to sprint back to Camp Kickass, paying no mind to the cries of the villagers behind them. "Mortars! Give me fucking mortars!" roared Yule as he waved his arms at the team up on the hill. The 50 cal was barking a challenge along with the spitting M249s and 240 Bravos arranged around it, and together they spat a wall of lead and death down below the dire wolves charging Camp Kickass. The damn things had come up so fast and suddenly that they barely had time to register what was even coming at them, costing them precious seconds to lay down their fields of fire. AR-15s, AK-47s, and World War II bolt-action rifles roared in defiance to the bays of the dire wolves charging at them from below. "I'll give you that!" Coco yelled, slamming a fresh magazine into his FAL as Cole ripped the pin out of a grenade and held it tight. "They're bigger than polar bears!" The 50 caliber rounds from Betty slammed home into the charging pack of the dire wolves, ripping chunks of meat and fur away, and great gouts of crimson that spilled down onto the grass and rushing paws below. But it took a lot of concentrated fire to bring down even one. Yule saw one Veil Rider fire a Mosin at a direwolf that was 150 yards away, and then watched the 7.62 x 54R round loudly ricochet off the skull of its target. Thankfully, the mortar team had figured itself out, and finally belched out its first round fired in anger. The HE round took a while to come down due to its arc, but with luck they managed to bring it down 100 yards in front of the trench network and right beside two dire wolves. Dire wolves were tough, but they weren't 81mm HE round tough. The mortar rent the ground apart, and the two dire wolves were nearly blown into giblets of meat by the shockwave of the round, the shrapnel from it screeching through the air and doing the rest of the job with ease. The military veterans didn't even flinch when the round came down, while others died for cover, their weapons clattering down beside them. When the dire wolves were almost on top of them, Cole threw his grenade, as did many others, and the frags did their intended purpose on the dire wolves, tearing muscle and meat away from bone and body. Ripples of concussive air played a tune of death and destruction on the ears as the grenades cooked off, as if a giant was tap dancing on the graves of the beasts that were so folly to charge the lines. Their charge staggered. The dire wolves gave a deadly pause, allowing Betty to rake across the last two remaining living dire wolves. The crews focused their fire while the mortar let fly another round, and after it landed, there was no more threat to have. The mortar crews had decided to risk the biscuit, and angled their mortar down into an unnatural position so the round would land faster. Not the greatest or most logical idea, but such things came from the minds of the irregular. Yule decocked the hammer on his M9 and looked around, checking for wounded but thankfully found none. A lot of people were scared out of their fucking minds, but they were alive, and that's what counted. "If they're alive, put them down," Coco shouted, and a few Veil Riders with larger calibers walked out and began emptying entire magazines directly into the skulls of any direwolf that even twitched. Cole was squatting down beside one that lay dead further away, staring at it in fascination as he ran his hand along its bloody neck fur. This one had gone down by a lucky 50 cal to the top of the skull, and was mostly intact. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, when he managed to actually get his hand around one of its paws and admired the claws of it. It was with little doubt that these were the things that tore that rescue team apart when they came through the Veil in search of the lost kid. They wouldn't have even had a chance with how fast these giant wolves were. When the sniper team finally arrived, Fort Kickass was attempting to haul these things off and away while machine guns looked on. Other Veil Riders had gone into the process of trying to skin the ones that were mostly intact and having a hell of a time of it. The dire wolves were so large that some of the Veil Riders had shucked their clothes, and now looked like blood-covered goblins as they scrambled over the carcasses to cut and saw away at the hides. Yule saw the sniper team loitering near the most forward trench and waved them over, once again finding him with a pouch of coffee in his hand. "Any good news, I hope?" Yule murmured over the din of more digging and the occasional Veil Rider lumbering around with ammo cans. "Yeah," Chicks panted softly, her face bright and happy. "We found elves." Yule raised his eyebrows, his teeth gripping the top of a sugar packet. Coco had arrived as well, wiping what looked like bloody water away from his face. Both of them said the word elves at the same time, the inflections of the responses standing apart from each other. While Coco seemed excited, Yule seemed hesitant. The sniper team gave the report while Chick showed them the many pictures she had taken on her phone, giving the two commanders more or less a general overview of the village. Neither of them were particularly happy to hear the village had overheard the gunfire of them battling the direwolves. Coco nudged Yule with his elbow, Yule almost fumbling the open sugar packet. "It's only a matter of time until they come over here. Humans are curious enough as it is." Yule stared down angrily at the coffee pouch in his hand as he slowly tipped the sugar packet down into it. To be quite frank, he was terrified of meeting elves. The thought alone had plagued him for days as he prepared to head into the Veil. If every myth was to be true, they were heading into the lair of apex predators a few notches above a normal human. If things went south, they would no longer hold the advantage, and God forbid if a Veil Rider died and somehow the elves got a hold of their weapon. Yule could appreciate Coco's enthusiasm, but damned if the idea didn't make him pucker so hard he became airtight when he closed his mouth. The two co-commanders talked it over for quite some time. Both of them explained their reservations or objectives when it came to the plains elves that the sniper team had found. In the end, Coco won the bout, and with much groaning about it, Yule picked up his rifle, put on his entire combat kit, and tugged his OD green patrol cap on snugly. When he walked out, Coco and the team of Veil Riders he had put together were almost vibrating from the excitement coursing through their bodies. 20 pairs of eyes wide open and waiting for the order to move out. Yule narrowed his eyes and pointed at a Veil Rider in the rear. "That fucking body pillow stays here." And that's the end of Chapter 2 of the Veil Riders. Again, if you liked the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to Nerbeardia and click the bell icon so you know when the videos are released through the week. I do appreciate all the good comments down below. I'm taking into consideration all the other comments that are not good or at least constructive. But I am glad you guys are enjoying the story. It makes me really happy that my writing is giving you some kind of entertainment through these dark and boring times with the coronavirus. Additionally, if there are some tropes you want to see happen or some kind of things you haven't seen in this kind of setting happen, just put it down below in the comments and I'll try and maybe think about working it in, or if it's too outlandish, I'll just ignore it. But if you might have a good idea, by all means, put it down in the comments below. Fucking, I love ideas from other people being used and turned into stories that the fans want to see. But this has been Guard Bro, and I will see you next time.